Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with charm, wit, and absolute control. But even America's most beloved host had limits. Some guests didn't just test those limits, they shattered them, and the door to The Tonight Show slammed shut. Was it ego, chaos, or simply the wrong joke at the wrong time? Stick around because these stories reveal how Carson decided who stayed in the spotlight and who would never see a stage again. Robin Williams. Robin Williams was a force of nature, a whirlwind of impressions, voices, and manic energy that could fill a room before he even sat down. For many viewers, it was pure genius. For Carson, it was chaos. Williams's rapid-fire improvisations often left Johnny struggling to steer the conversation. Instead of polished interviews, the segments became unpredictable theater, with Robin bouncing off walls, sometimes literally. Carson respected talent, but he also demanded control. When Williams barreled over questions with a 10-minute riff on airline food or turned Carson's straight lines into punchlines of his own, Johnny's famously icy smile said it all. He wasn't amused at losing command of his own stage. Insiders whispered that Carson found Robin exhausting, brilliant but untamable. Though Williams later became a beloved talk show guest elsewhere, his visits to The Tonight Show dwindled. For Carson, brilliance wasn't enough if it came wrapped in chaos. The king of late night preferred calm, and Robin Williams brought a storm. Joan Rivers. Few bands cut deeper than Johnny's with Joan Rivers. She wasn't just a guest, she was his protege. Carson handpicked her as a regular substitute host, even suggesting she could one day inherit his chair. But in 1986, everything changed. When Fox offered Rivers her own competing late-night show, she didn't tell Johnny first. Carson felt blindsided, betrayed both personally and professionally. The man who had championed her rise never spoke to her again. Overnight, Rivers was exiled from The Tonight Show. She wasn't just banned, she was erased. Carson's silence was so absolute that even after his death, the feud cast a shadow. For years, Rivers herself admitted the ban devastated her career and her friendship with Johnny. Though she rebuilt her empire with sharp comedy and red carpet dominance, she never returned to Carson's couch. For Johnny, loyalty was sacred, and betrayal, once felt, was never forgiven. Bobcat Goldthwait. Bobcat Goldthwait was unlike any comic Carson had ever introduced. With a raspy scream, anarchic delivery, and unpredictable stage presence, he was both hilarious and terrifying. On stage, he seemed like a man about to combust, and sometimes he nearly did. During one infamous appearance, Goldthwait lit props on fire and launched into chaotic rants that left Johnny frozen behind the desk. NBC executives were horrified, and Carson himself reportedly vowed never to risk another meltdown. What was edgy in the comedy? Clubs became a nightmare under the scrutiny of live television. Carson thrived on order. Goldthwait thrived on disorder. It was oil and water, and the fallout was immediate. After a handful of unpredictable appearances, Bobcat's invites disappeared. While his cult following grew elsewhere, The Tonight Show wanted no part of the chaos. Johnny had drawn his line, and Bobcat had crossed it in flames, literally. Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, but she was also one of its most controversial. In the 1970s, her outspoken political activism, especially her opposition to the Vietnam War, made headlines around the world. For Carson, that was a problem. When Fonda appeared on The Tonight Show, she wasn't content to stick to movie promotion or lighthearted banter. She spoke about politics, protests, and causes that divided the country. While some applauded her candor, Carson's middle America audience wasn't thrilled. Johnny himself looked visibly uncomfortable, often steering the conversation back towards safer ground. Behind the scenes, NBC executives grew uneasy about the backlash. Carson valued smooth interviews that entertained without alienating viewers, and Fonda's presence became too risky. Invitations slowed, then stopped. For Fonda, it hardly mattered. Her career continued with or without Johnny's approval. But her absence from the show was telling. Politics and Carson's stage simply didn't mix. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was a revolutionary comedian, raw, fearless, and uncompromising. His routines about race, drugs, and life's harsh realities changed the face of stand-up comedy. But on Carson's stage, that edge created tension. During appearances, Pryor often veered into material that pushed the limits of what NBC censors would allow. Johnny, who built his empire on a delicate balance of charm and control, squirmed as Pryor unleashed blunt truths that went far beyond late-night comfort zones. Producers worried, Carson looked uneasy, and the audience sensed the friction. Behind closed doors, Johnny reportedly admired Pryor's brilliance, but dreaded the unpredictability. Too much honesty, too much fire. It was dangerous for his show that lived on broad appeal. Over time, Pryor's appearances became rare, a casualty of Carson's preference for polished entertainment over raw reality. Pryor thrived on stage and screen, but on The Tonight Show, his honesty cost him the spotlight. Andrew Dice Clay. In the late 1980s, Andrew Dice Clay became one of the most controversial comedians in America. His leather jacket, swaggering attitude, and unapologetically vulgar nursery rhymes shocked audiences and divided the country. To his fans, he was groundbreaking. To Carson, he was a liability. When Clay appeared on The Tonight Show, his brand of comedy clashed with Johnny's carefully curated image. The jokes were raw, filled with innuendo that had NBC's censors sweating bullets. Carson's forced grin betrayed his discomfort, and insiders said Johnny hated being caught in the middle of material that could ignite outrage. Carson didn't like vulgarity for vulgarity's sake, and Dice didn't tone it down, he amped it up. After a handful of tense appearances, Clay's invites dried up. He went on to sell out arenas and stir endless controversy, but he never again had Carson's stage. For Johnny, late night wasn't the place for shock value. Dice Clay learned that the hard way. Truman Capote. Truman Capote was as famous for his razor-sharp wit as he was for his writing. But that wit could cut, and Carson wasn't fond of being the target. When Capote visited The Tonight Show, his sly, cutting remarks often drifted into uncomfortable territory. Instead of breezy banter, Capote delivered sly observations that bordered on insults. Johnny, who thrived on control, struggled when a guest pushed conversations into unpredictable, biting directions. Producers whispered that Carson found him brilliant but exhausting, a man who refused to play by talk show rules. Capote loved to dominate a room, and The Tonight Show was no exception. But Carson didn't appreciate guests who overshadowed him, and after a few barbed exchanges, Capote stopped being booked. His literary reputation remained intact, but his absence from Carson's stage was telling. The Tonight Show was built on charm, not verbal duels. And with Truman Capote, every visit risked becoming one. Brigitte Bardot. By the time French icon Brigitte Bardot landed on American television, she was already one of the most controversial stars in the world. Known for her beauty, boldness, and outspoken views, Bardot was never afraid to shock an audience. But what worked in Europe didn't always work on Carson's stage. During her rare U.S. appearances, Bardot's frank answers and flirtatious demeanor rattled Johnny, who preferred guests who played within the boundaries of American television's conservative tone. Rumors swirled that producers dreaded what she might say next. Would she flirt too openly, challenge Johnny, offend advertisers? Carson, ever protective of his show's reputation, quietly kept Bardot at a distance. She didn't need The Tonight Show. Her fame stretched across continents, but her absence became clear as the years went by. For Carson, unpredictability was a gamble he rarely took, and Bardot was too much of a wild card. John Belushi. John Belushi was comedy's ultimate wild child. On Saturday Night Live, his manic energy, physical humor, and rock and roll lifestyle made him a breakout star. But that same explosive presence clashed with Carson's tightly controlled environment. When Belushi appeared on The Tonight Show, he was unpredictable, bouncing from wild impressions to sudden outbursts that had the studio audience roaring, while Johnny sat frozen behind the desk. Insiders later said Carson found him funny, but exhausting, a whirlwind he simply couldn't contain. NBC executives shared the concern, whispering about Belushi's hard-living reputation and what might spill over on live television. Carson valued polish, timing, and order. Belushi thrived on chaos, feeding off the very unpredictability Johnny avoided at all costs. Eventually, his appearances faded. His tragic death at just 33 cemented his legend, But his short tenure on Carson's stage told the story. Belushi was too combustible for The Tonight Show. And for Johnny, control mattered more than comedy's wildest storm. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was one of the biggest names in comedy, but his appearances on The Tonight Show often left Carson fuming. Lewis loved attention, and he had a habit of hijacking interviews, turning the spotlight squarely on himself. Instead of quick banter, Lewis would launch into extended routines, leaving Johnny with little room to steer the conversation. Worse, his over-the-top antics sometimes bordered on mockery of Carson's format. Johnny, who guarded his authority carefully, disliked being upstaged, and Lewis did it repeatedly. Behind the scenes, reports say the tension was palpable. Carson respected Lewis's fame but disliked his arrogance. Over time, Lewis's invitations dwindled. His larger-than-life persona, no longer welcome on a stage, Carson considered his own kingdom. For viewers, it was a clash of egos. For Carson, it was simple. If you didn't respect the crown, you didn't sit beside the king. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was a titan of Hollywood, but when it came to talk shows, he was notoriously difficult. Brando disliked the very idea of interviews, often dismissing them as shallow exercises. When he sat across from Johnny Carson, it showed. Instead of playing along, Brando answered in clipped sentences or steered conversations into brooding lectures. Carson, who prided himself on witty exchanges, was left stranded. Audiences squirmed, and Johnny's frustration was visible. He wasn't in control, and that was unacceptable. Behind the scenes, Carson reportedly decided it wasn't worth the risk. Brando's disdain for small talk, coupled with his unpredictable moods, made for tense television. He wasn't banned with a public announcement, but the door quietly closed. For Carson, interviews were theater, and Brando refused to act. The result? The legendary actor never became a regular guest, proof that even icons weren't exempt from Johnny's rules. Howard Stern. By the late 1980s, Howard Stern was already earning his reputation as the shock jock. Outrageous, crude, and deliberately provocative, Stern was a walking controversy. Carson's team knew it, and Johnny himself wasn't eager to gamble with chaos. When Stern did appear, he was exactly what NBC feared, unfiltered and unpredictable. Instead of lighthearted banter, Stern pushed boundaries with risque comments and irreverent jabs. Carson, who built his empire on control and broad appeal, forced a smile, but his body, language screamed discomfort. Afterward, the decision was made. Stern wasn't coming back. He thrived on being banned. It added to his rebel mystique. But for Carson, who wanted smooth, family-friendly late night, Stern was poison. The clash was inevitable. Stern built his career on breaking rules, and Carson built his on keeping them. On The Tonight Show, there was only room for one philosophy, and Stern lost. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was a musical genius, but his avant-garde style and razor-sharp tongue made him a nightmare for traditional television. When he appeared on Carson's stage, his refusal to play by the rules became obvious within minutes. Instead of light chat about albums or performances, Zappa dissected the absurdities of pop culture and television itself. His deadpan delivery puzzled audiences and made Carson visibly uneasy. What Zappa saw as biting satire, Johnny saw as sabotage. Guests were meant to entertain, not critique the very stage they stood on. Behind the curtain, producers quickly decided he wasn't worth the gamble. Zappa was too intellectual, too unpredictable, and far too likely to alienate the broad middle American audience Carson prized. Zappa, of course, didn't care. He thrived on being an outsider and wore rejection as a badge of honor. But in Johnny's universe, rebellion wasn't celebrated. And for a host obsessed with polish and control, Zappa was never invited back. George Carlin. George Carlin became one of the greatest comedians of all time, but his early visits to Carson's show revealed a dangerous edge. Unlike the safe humor of most guests, Carlin's routines tackled politics, religion, and language in ways that unsettled both Johnny and NBC. During one appearance, Carlin riffed on censorship itself, joking about the very words he couldn't say on television. Carson forced a chuckle, but his eyes betrayed concern. NBC executives panicked. Carlin wasn't just funny, he was controversial. And controversy was something Johnny avoided at all costs. Though Carson respected Carlin's brilliance, the Tonight stage wasn't the place for social revolution. Over time, his appearances became rare, as his material grew sharper and edgier. Carlin didn't need Johnny, he built his own empire of counterculture comedy. But the band revealed the truth. Carson's show wasn't about changing the world. It was about keeping it comfortable. Raquel Welch. Raquel Welch was a 1960s icon, celebrated for her beauty and commanding presence. But behind the glamour, tension brewed between her and Johnny Carson. Reports suggested Johnny found her difficult, citing her diva-like reputation and icy demeanor. On air, the chemistry was flat. Welch often seemed aloof, offering short answers that killed Carson's rhythm. Audiences noticed the chill, and Johnny himself looked visibly irritated. For a host who thrived on playful banter, dead air was unforgivable. Producers eventually stopped inviting her. Welch didn't need The Tonight Show. Her films and magazine covers kept her famous, but her absence was a quiet statement. Carson preferred guests who made the show shine, not stall, and in his eyes, Welch brought tension instead of charm. For Johnny, that was reason enough to close the door. Steve Martin. Today, Steve Martin is hailed as one of comedy's sharpest minds, but when he first stepped onto Carson's stage in the 1970s, his absurd, surreal style left Johnny and much of the audience scratching their heads. Instead of polished punchlines, Martin performed offbeat gags, juggling with empty props, wearing bizarre costumes, or delivering anti-jokes that mocked the very idea of comedy. Younger viewers found him brilliant. Carson? Not so much. His bemused expression often read less as amusement and more as bewilderment. Carson built his empire on timing and traditional setups. Martin's unpredictable surrealism threw that off balance. Insiders said Johnny considered him too strange in the beginning, and invites became scarce. Of course, Martin eventually became one of America's most celebrated comedians, proving the world caught up with his style. But in Carson's controlled late-night kingdom, he was ahead of his time and ahead of Johnny's patience. Milton Berle was television royalty long before Carson took over late night. Known as Mr. Television, Berle's reputation as a pioneer came with an ego to match. When he guested on The Tonight Show, he often dominated the stage, leaning on old-school vaudeville bits that didn't mesh with Carson's slick, modern approach. Behind the desk, Johnny bristled. He disliked Berle's tendency to hog the spotlight and his refusal to adapt to new styles of comedy. Worse, some say Johnny resented Berle's arrogance, an older comic who still acted like he owned television. Carson tolerated him at first but gradually phased him out. Berle's larger-than-life presence clashed with Johnny's belief that there was room for only one king of late night, and on Carson's stage there was no doubt who wore the crown: Bette Midler. Bette Midler's voice and stage presence were undeniable. She could charm an audience with a single note, and she often did, but her brash humor and unfiltered personality sometimes rubbed Carson the wrong way. When Midler guested, she wasn't afraid to tease Johnny or push jokes past his comfort zone. For audiences, it was fresh and exciting. For Carson, it sometimes felt like losing control. Insiders claimed he admired her talent, but worried she'd overshadow him if booked too often. The tension grew especially noticeable when she leaned into bawdy humor, a style Carson avoided to keep NBC executives calm. Slowly, her appearances tapered off. Midler didn't need The Tonight Show. Her Broadway runs and albums made her a star, but her reduced presence spoke volumes. Carson welcomed strong personalities, but only if they played within his lines. Chevy Chase rose to fame on Saturday Night Live and quickly became one of Hollywood's hottest comedic actors. But his cocky, aloof demeanor earned him enemies across the industry, including Johnny Carson. On air, Chase often appeared dismissive, offering sarcastic replies instead of engaging conversation. Johnny, who thrived on warmth and rhythm, grew irritated with Chevy's habit of acting as if the show was beneath him. Producers whispered that Carson privately disliked his arrogance, and audiences picked up on the chilly exchanges. Carson quietly pulled the plug. Chase's appearances became rare and eventually non-existent. The clash showed a fundamental truth. Johnny could handle almost anyone, but he couldn't abide guests who didn't respect the privilege of sitting in that chair. Chevy may have dominated the box office for a time, but on The Tonight Show, his act didn't fly. Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce changed comedy forever with his fearless commentary on politics, religion, and censorship. His routines were raw, honest, and years ahead of their time. But while his brilliance was undeniable, his controversies made him a nightmare for television producers, and Carson knew it. By the time Johnny became king of late night, Bruce's career had already peaked, yet his reputation lingered like a warning sign. He was too volatile, too outspoken, and far too likely to land The Tonight Show in hot water. Whenever his name surfaced, NBC executives and Carson himself preferred to steer clear. As a result, Bruce never became a fixture on Carson's stage. His groundbreaking comedy inspired generations, but it didn't fit Johnny's formula of safe, broad laughs for middle America. Carson built his empire on charm and control. Bruce built his on tearing down barriers, and control was the one thing Johnny refused to surrender. Cher. Cher was a superstar who lived life on her own terms, and that unapologetic honesty often clashed with Carson's carefully controlled stage. While her famous feud with David Letterman grabbed more headlines, Johnny had his own misgivings about her appearances. On The Tonight Show, Cher's sharp tongue and refusal to hold back made Johnny visibly uneasy. She cracked jokes that bordered on insults, sometimes even teasing Johnny himself in ways that audiences weren't sure were playful or cutting. Behind the scenes, producers whispered that Carson didn't trust her unpredictability. One unscripted remark could create backlash with middle American viewers. As a result, her invitations became fewer and fewer. Cher didn't care. Her music, movies, and bold persona kept her career unstoppable. But Carson's quiet ban revealed his limits. He loved charisma, but not when it threatened to overshadow his own. With Cher, the gamble was too big. Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper was Hollywood's rebel, a man known as much for his off-screen volatility as his on-screen brilliance. When he appeared on talk shows, anything could happen, and that's exactly what Carson dreaded. Hopper's interviews often veered into rambling monologues, fueled by his wild lifestyle and unpredictable energy. Carson, who thrived on precision and polish, was left scrambling to maintain order. At times, Hopper's behavior made producers nervous, with whispers about his reputation for partying looming in the background. Johnny wasn't willing to risk a live meltdown. Hopper's visits became rare, then non-existent. While his legend as an actor and director grew, his absence from The Tonight Show was clear. Carson's rule was simple. Brilliance was welcome, but chaos wasn't. Hopper, no matter how talented, brought too much baggage for Johnny's stage. Dean Martin. Dean Martin was a Rat Pack legend, a singer, actor, and comedian whose smooth style defined cool. But his close ties to Frank Sinatra complicated things with Carson. Johnny always felt uneasy around the Rat Pack, whose swagger sometimes overshadowed his own charm. Martin's on-air appearances often turned into playful drinking jokes or inside stories that made Carson seem like an outsider. While the audience loved it, Johnny didn't. He valued guests who elevated the show without making him feel like a sidekick. Reports suggested that Carson, wary of being upstaged, cooled on booking Dean too frequently. Dean didn't need Carson. Vegas and Hollywood kept him famous, but the reduced appearances revealed Johnny's protectiveness. He wanted to be the star of The Tonight Show, and when Dean Martin's aura threatened that, Johnny closed the door. Mick Jagger. By the late 1970s, Mick Jagger was the ultimate rock star, wild, flamboyant, and unpredictable. That was exactly why Carson wanted little to do with him. When the Rolling Stones performed, their concerts were chaos, screaming fans, provocative antics, and outrageous energy. Johnny's show, by contrast, was built on smooth polish. The one time Jagger appeared, his dismissive answers and aloof attitude made Carson bristle. The chemistry was non-existent, and Johnny clearly didn't enjoy playing straight man to a rock god who couldn't care less. Behind the scenes, NBC executives worried about Jagger's image, his unpredictable remarks, and his sheer refusal to conform. The result was simple: he wasn't invited back. Jagger and the Stones went on to global superstardom, but Carson's stage remained off-limits. In Johnny's universe, rock and roll excess had no seat at the desk. Oliver Reed. Few actors had a reputation as notorious as Oliver Reed. With his booming voice, wild bravado, and notorious love of alcohol, Reed was a booking nightmare for live television. In Britain, he left chaos everywhere: slurred interviews, on-air shouting, and even physical altercations. For producers, it was unpredictable theater. For Carson, it was unacceptable. Johnny prided himself on control, and Reed was the opposite. One bad appearance could sink a show, and, with Oliver, disaster wasn't a possibility, it was inevitable. Carson reportedly wanted nothing to do with that gamble. The decision was made early. Reed would not become a regular guest. Unlike others who slowly faded from the lineup, Reed was blacklisted before he ever had a chance. It wasn't personal, it was business. The Tonight Show was built on charm and class, and Reed embodied chaos. For Johnny, the calculation was simple: protect the brand. With Oliver Reed, both control and dignity would have gone out the window. Johnny Carson's reign over late night wasn't just about jokes and charm, it was about power. He welcomed stars, but only if they played by his rules. From fiery comedians to uncontrollable rock stars, those who crossed the line found the door shut for good. What do you think? Were these bans fair, or was Carson too protective of his throne? Drop your thoughts below, hit that subscribe button, and let's see whose name you think should have made this list.